today I would show you how I've been making some ceramic clocks. I've been making quite a few ceramic clocks recently, partly because I started making them because a few months ago I broke my wrist. It was quite a serious break. It was broken in 4 places and it was in a cast for quite a while, and then I had quite a lot of physio and rehab to get it moving again. But when I first started making things again, when I was working again and starting to make things again, I had to keep the strain on the wrist as little as possible. So I was making projects that didn't involve too much kind of heavy duty work with the clay. So that's why I started making the clocks, because it's more about sort of fine detail and decoration. But I got really into it. I really love making clocks. It's a really fun project. So I thought I'd share it with you. This is one that I made just recently. It's a slab clock, although you can, of course, you can make these circles on the wheel if you prefer to do that. It's been glazed with, it's got a clear glaze on it, and it's been decorated with some overglaze luster paints, which is really lovely if you like that sort of thing. Anyway, I really enjoy making clocks, so I thought I'd share it with you. I hope you like it. If you've not seen any of my videos before, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and then you'll get a notification when I upload something new. Thanks for watching. When I'm making a clock, I use a template like this. It's marked accurately in the centre of the clock, and also I've got these lines radiating outwards, which are where the numbers need to be positioned. I'm using an A3 piece of craft foam. The A3 piece isn't quite large enough, so I'm just going to have to snip a little bit off and then tape it on like I did here. So I'll do that quickly now. Right, so first of all, draw a circle around the cake board. Then to find the centre of the circle, the exact centre of the circle, it's really easy to do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mark a series of lines around the edge of here that are the same length, and I'll show you how you can use those to then find the dead centre of the circle. I'm going to draw a line about here that is 6 inches long. So the line is 6 inches from this point on the edge of the circle to that point on the edge of the circle. So 6-inch line, and I'm only choosing a 6-inch line because it's easy to divide 6 by 2. So I'm going to mark a point halfway through the centre of that line at 3 inches, and then I'm going to repeat that process over here. And then what you need to do is use a ruler of some kind with a right angle on it. Line it up on one of the lines that you've drawn against the midpoint of the line, and then draw a line from the midpoint at a right angle, and then repeat that process on the other 2 lines too. You actually only need to do 2 of these lines because the point at which they intersect is the middle of the circle, but I like to do 3 lines just in case I've made a mistake with one of the lines, because if I have made a mistake then they won't all intersect. I seem to have done that right. Okay, so that is the middle of your circle. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the exact points where I want the numbers to be positioned around the clock too. I'll draw a line straight through the middle. So that's going to be my 12 o'clock point from the midpoint. And that is going to be my 3 o'clock. And then that is going to be my 9 o'clock. and of course that's going to be the 6 o'clock. The way to find the 1, 2, 4, 5, etc. all the way around is to use one of these. They're called a draftsman's compass. So you find the length of from the midpoint to the edge. Now what you can do is you put your compass on one of the quarter points. So if I do a little line like that, that's going to be my 1 o'clock point there, and I can turn it and do another line there. That's going to be my 2 o'clock point. So that is going to be my 1 o'clock line. It's my 2 o'clock. There's all the points marked accurately. So these are the stamps, these are the number stamps that I'm going to use in the clay. So for example, I'm going to have 12 at that point. The stamp is about ½ inch from the edge of the clay, and I'm just going to mark here where I'm going to position the stamps on the clay, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a little hole in the template, and then I'm going to use that. I'm going to use the needle tool to make a mark on the clay slab, so I know where to position the numbers on the clay slab. So I'm going to go around the whole thing and do the same. So now that I have marked all the points on the template, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a needle tool and I'm just going to make some holes, one in the centre, because what I want to do is when I lay it on the clay slab, I want to be able to put the needle tool through just to mark on the clay. I'm going to do the same thing with the points where I want the numbers to go. Right, so the next thing to do is to roll out a clay slab and cut it out. With the clock face, you don't have to use a clay slab. You can throw a circle on the wheel, or you can roll out a slab. I've made a video on how to roll an even slab of clay before, so I won't go into all the details of how I do that here, but I'll put a link to that video right now, so that if you want some more information about it, you can watch that video now. Just a few details here. What I do when I'm rolling the slab is I turn it over quite regularly and change the direction, just so that the clay gets stretched in a number of different directions. And then I'm using roller guides. The roller guides are about 5mm thick, and once it's got to a certain size, I transfer it onto a piece of vinyl backed tablecloth so that I can move it around easily without having to pick the clay slab up, potentially stretching the clay. And then just get rid of any air bubbles with a needle tool and then compress it with a rubber rib once it's the right size. So then I'll position the template on the clay slab and cut around the template carefully. Because it's a craft foam template, it's quite easy to make the shape when you're cutting to press too hard against the foam template and make the shape a bit wonky. So just be careful when you're cutting out with the clay knife. And then peel the excess away. And then once the clay's been cut out, I just go around the edge with a slightly damp sponge just to smooth down the side. Because it's easier to do that now when the clay is quite soft. So to tidy it up a bit before it starts drying. And then to turn it over at this point, I don't want the clay to stretch anymore, I want it to keep its shape, so I just put another sheet of the fabric on top and then flip it over. And by sandwiching it between the two sheets of fabric, you stop the clay from stretching and losing its shape. And then you're in a good position to tidy up the reverse side. And then just to put the stamp, if you're going to use a stamp, now's a good time to do it, because then I'm going to turn it back over again and then start putting the detail on the clock face. And at this point what I do is I put the template back on top and line it up accurately. And then I'm just using the needle tool to lightly press through the holes that I made earlier on with the centre of the clock face and also where the numbers are going to go. You don't need to go through too far, it's really just to make a tiny mark on the clay so you know where to position the numbers. And I'm also making a very small mark on the side there of where the quarter points are, so the 12, 3, 6 and 9 o'clock. And that's just going to help me line up my decoration. Later on I've got a transfer decoration that I'm going to use, which I need to line up. So I'm making a very fine mark on the face of the clock here where the quarter marks are. Again, as I say, this is just so that I can line up my decoration later on. And after I've added these lines, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a hole in the centre of the slab, and that hole is going to be where the clock mechanism comes through later on. And I would say that with this particular clock face, that little black thing that you see there is the nozzle on a slip trailing bottle that I had. I don't normally use that one, and I have to say that that hole that I made in this clock is slightly too large. I normally just use I've got this little pen lid that's the right size, but I couldn't find it, so I used the nozzle, and it was slightly too large, so you'll see later on that when I put the mechanism on I had to use a washer to keep the mechanism steady. So I wouldn't recommend, I mean, when you've got the clock mechanism, just measure the post that has to go through the clock and then find something that's the right size to make the hole. So here you'll see that what I'm doing is I am just lining up the stamps. These are my number stamps. I'm just lining them up around the clock face. These stamps are they're made by a company called Relief, which I've mentioned before. I really like their stamps. They're really nicely made, and they're very clean. They leave a very clean mark. So what I'm doing is I'm just lining the numbers up with the tiny little marks. You can't really see the marks I made on the clay earlier on with the template, but they are there. They're tiny little marks made by the needle tool, and I'm just lining up the numbers so that they're positioned just above the mark. And you know, you don't have to use the marks if you don't want to. You can just kind of eyeball it, but I find that it's quite easy to get things a little bit misaligned if you don't sort of plan it out in advance. And with a clock, you do need the hands to be pointing in the right place in order for the clock to work well. And as I'm going around, I just tidy up the clock face as well. And then once the numbers are on, you can really decorate the clock in whatever way you like. I'm using a process where I'm going to transfer an image onto the clock face. That's the image that I've designed. I've printed it off onto something called a pronto plate, or it's also called a polyester litho plate. I designed the image myself, and then I've printed it off onto this special paper, and where you can basically load the paper up with ceramic stain and then transfer the ceramic stain image onto a slab of clay. Now, doing this, it's a bit of a process, and I have made a video on how to transfer photographic images or designed images onto clay. I'm going to put a link in this video to that particular video right now, so that you can watch it if you want to use this particular process. And so I'm just going to sort of whiz over what I do when I'm making these transfers now, because otherwise this video would become extremely long. But you can experiment with it if you haven't used it before. If you haven't used this technique before, you can give it a go. I really like it. I used it, like I say, with a clock face. You can decorate it in whatever way you want. You can glaze it, you can underglaze it, you can draw on it. I used this particular technique because I wanted quite a clean image, and I was going for something that had a kind of a vintage floral feel. So that's why I use this particular technique. But as I say, it's up to you. So what I'm doing here is I'm just loading. I'm using the brayer to load some ceramic stain mixed up with linseed oil onto the pronto plate. Load it onto the pronto plate and then just clean it off, and the dark areas of the laser printed design absorb the ceramic stain, and then you can transfer it onto the clay slab. I'm just sort of lining it up carefully with the quarter marks I made earlier on, and then I'm just going to lower it slowly onto the clay slab. Now it's in place now. I'm just wiping off some of the stain from the back of the pronto plate that's leaked through, just to make sure it doesn't go onto the clay slab. And then I'm just going to gently rub the back of the litho plate just to transfer the ceramic stain onto the clay slab. So just rubbing it really gently with the rubber rib, and then you can lift off the pronto plate, and there you go. That's the design that has been transferred onto the clock face. So the plan with this clock is that I'm going to wait for it to be bone dry, and then I'm going to bisque fire it, and then once it's been bisque fired, I'm going to glaze it with some clear glaze. Once it's been clear glazed, I'm going to put some luster overglaze paints on top and fire it again. But the first thing to do once I've tidied it up is just to let the clock face dry, and that's a bit of an art in itself, because if you dry it too quickly, a large flat slab of clay will curl or warp when it's drying if you don't dry it really slowly and evenly. So what I do is I cover up the clock face with a metal rack, which sits just above the surface of the clock, so it's not touching the clock, and then I'll cover that up with a sheet of plastic. And the reason I put the metal rack on top is to stop this plastic from sagging onto the slab, which will damage the design and also will make the clay a bit sort of muddy and ruin the nice smooth slab that you've just made. So put a metal rack on top, cover it up with a piece of plastic, and then I just leave that until the clay has firmed up enough so that I can lift it without the clay, without the slab sort of bending or flopping about all over the place. So here are 2 clocks that are just sitting and drying out fully. I've covered them up with a plastic bag just to really slow down the drying process. I'm just checking to see how they're doing, and you can see that what I've done is I've got one metal rack on top to stop the plastic bag from damaging the clock face, and that is separated from the other. I've just used a couple of pieces of Lego there to separate the metal racks, but there's the clock, and it's more or less dry now. It needs to dry out a little bit more before I can bisque fire it, but it's almost there. So yeah, those pieces of Lego are just to separate the 2 metal racks. It's not very high tech, but it seems to work. And there's the other clock that I just made. So the clocks have been bisque fired and glaze fired with a clear glaze, and I'm just about to decorate one of them with some overglazed lustres. It's important to use a respirator mask when you're painting with gold and coloured lustres because the fumes can be toxic. So use a respirator and also paint with the windows open and plenty of ventilation. I also wear rubber gloves when I'm painting with lustre paints because I don't like getting it on my skin. It's quite sticky and difficult to remove. So I'm just applying the paint with a fine brush. The numbers I'm doing in gold lustre, and then the leaves and the flowers I'm doing with coloured lustre paints. As you apply them, when you apply them, they go on a brown, sort of a range of brown colours. Some of them look a bit peachy when they haven't been fired yet, but when you fire them, the true colour will develop in the kiln and looks really lovely. Can look really lovely. So just apply them quite carefully. I start from the top left-hand side and then work my way across so that as I'm painting I'm not smudging it with my hand or my elbow. If you do smudge it, what I do is I just wipe up the lustre paint with a bit of thinner. You get some lustre paint thinner and you can just wipe it off with a cotton bud. So once all the lustre paint has been applied, I fire it for a 3rd time at a lower temperature of 700 degrees centigrade or 1292 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on where you are in the world. So that's the clock before it's gone into the kiln, and this is it afterwards when the colours, the gold luster's developed and the colours have developed too. This is the clock mechanism. You position the clock mechanism through the hole. As you can see, it's a bit too big. Like I explained earlier on, I made that hole just a little bit too big this time. Never mind. Putting a washer on top just to keep it in place, stop it from moving about, and then screw it on with a nut that's provided. These mechanisms you can just get on Amazon, or if you have an old clock from a thrift shop or something, you can use the old clock mechanism from an old clock if you like. But they're surprisingly easy to assemble. You just, once the nut's on, you can just press the hour hand on, the minute hand, and if there's a second hand as well, you just press that on. Line them all up at 12 o'clock. And then you put the battery in and set the clock to the right time, and there is the finished clock. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. Bye!